Clash of the Classics.
Welcome to another edition of Clash of the Classics. Today's feature is made possible by our friends at the Automatic Transmission Rebuilders Association, or quite simply, the ATRA. ATRA is the largest and the oldest transmission network in the world. If you're experiencing transmission troubles of any kind, or you just simply have a transmission question, always check them out before you do anything at atra.com. All right, let's get right into it now. I'm Donnie. I'll be your host for the next few minutes, and today is going to be a blast. We're going to have some fun today. It's all about the 1969 Cadillac Eldorado battling that 1969 Buick Riviera. I want to start with the Eldorado. That 1969 Eldo is actually part of the 6th generation, and Gen 6 went from 1967 all the way through 1970. And back in the mid to late 60s, the personal luxury car market was definitely in a sweet spot. GM was set to take full advantage of it by offering a few different options to their buyers. There was the Buick Riviera, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, the Oldsmobile Tornado, and then of course this Eldorado. And Cadillac marketing division pushed it about as aggressively as they could, and I'd say it worked out pretty well for them. One of my favorite parts of the platform, aside from the plush interior, was the powertrain. For 1967, GM adapted their big 429 V8 to the front-wheel drive turbo 425 transmission that they were running in that Olds Tornado. And I want to take just a moment here to talk a little bit about this transmission because it's probably one of my favorite classic units. It was essentially a turbo 400 with the bell housing flipped around to face the same direction as the output shaft. And many of our audience here are transmission industry professionals, and most will remember that massively huge roller chain that powered the unit. And then another feature that a lot of transmission rebuilders will remember is that variable pitch torque converter that GM experimented with from 1964 through about 1967, I believe. Those of us in the business refer to it as the switch pitch converter, and if you've ever had a chance to work on one, you'll definitely remember it was a nightmare. The concept was great and the idea had merit, just didn't work very well in the actual application. The basic idea was to switch the stator blades in the converter to a high position when the driver stepped on the accelerator, which gave you better launch, and then to switch to a low position for better economy and cruising. The only problem was the converters were breaking down with a pretty high rate of failure. And then by 1968, GM scrapped the idea and went back to a fixed pitch stator. And that seemed to solve the problem of premature transmission breakdown. And then one note that I think is worth mentioning is there were some Japanese manufacturers in the late 80s and then even into the early 90s that picked up the idea. They actually made it work for a short time in some of their experimental stuff. But as of today, I know of no transmission with a switch pitch converter. If someone out there has or knows of a variable pitch platform that's being used today, please message us here because I'd like to speak with you. But back to our Eldorado discussion. In 1967, disc brakes were optional, and new standard safety equipment included an energy-absorbing steering column and then a pretty heavily padded instrument panel. The new 6th generation Eldorado was a huge success and quite a departure from the 5th generation body style, which really essentially was a dressed-up version of the DeVille. And then back in those days, a guy by the name of Bill Mitchell was GM's styling chief. And you talk about an industry giant. This guy was head of design at General Motors from 1958 through 1977 and is responsible for creating or influencing the design of over 72.5 million cars that were produced by General Motors. Pretty impressive stats. But he wanted the 6th generation Eldorado to be distinctive and unique with enough style change to set it apart from the Oldsmobile and the Buick. And the finished product definitely worked. The body lines of the Cadillac far more subtle, streamlined, a lot more angular than other GM models. And in 1967, the Eldorado tried running concealed headlights behind vacuum-assisted doors, but ended up scrapping the idea in 1968 because of the high cost of warranty mechanical problems. For being a larger luxury car, overall performance was impressive. Car would scoot from 0 to 60 in less than 9 seconds and a top speed of 120 miles an hour. Drivability and handling were highly praised by magazine reviews, and even though the MSRP on the car was considerably high for the time period, sales were still pretty excellent. In fact, with sales of more than 17,900 cars, which is almost 3 times the previous Eldorado high. That gave Cadillac its best year ever up to that point. In 1968, GM dropped in the all-new 375 horsepower, 472 cubic inch V8, and disc brakes became standard. Once again, sales set another record at about 24,500, with Eldorados accounting for nearly 11% of all Cadillacs sold. And then in 1969, as we mentioned earlier, the hidden headlamps were eliminated. A vinyl roof was available as an option, as was an all-new rim-blowing steering wheel. And for those of you who have never heard of a rim-blow steering wheel, it's simply a steering wheel with a horn button all the way around the inner circumference. It's kind of a cheesy option that didn't really catch on as well as Cadillac would have hoped for, and because of that, it was the only year that Cadillac offered it. Body changes from 68 to 69, pretty minimal, and it wasn't until 1970 that Cadillac introduced that new 500 cubic inch V8, which was the largest ever production V8. Certainly one of our favorite Cadillacs here at Horsepower for an Hour. My neighbor Craig Cole has one, and every time I see him in it, definitely takes me back to my younger years. Kudos to you, Craig. But one heck of a nice car. Original MSRP in 1969 was $6,700. Today, the estimated value is about $20,000. Before we go any further, I want to talk about the largest automatic transmission network on the planet. They are the Automatic Transmission Rebuilders Association. The ATRA makes our Clash of the Classics possible. No one knows transmissions better than ATRA. With a member network stretching from coast to coast, you can bet there's no better place to be when your car is experiencing transmission trouble than in an authorized ATRA service provider. Head on over to atra.com to find a service provider member near you. All right, let's talk about that 1969 Buick Riviera. To begin with, a little history here. The name Riviera is Latin for coastline, and Buick chose it because of the allure and the affluence of the French Riviera. And the name has been in the GM camp since way back in 1949. But moving ahead here to 1969, the 69 model year is part of the second generation of Riviera that ran from 1966 through 1970. And for 1966, General Motors considered sharing the Olds Tornado front-wheel drive technology with their all-new Riviera, but problems cropped up during early testing of the front drive prototype, and ultimately Buick decided the Riviera should stick with the rear-wheel drive. And we talked about some of those problems with the transmissions during our Cadillac discussion. But there were also some handling and stopping issues that had the engineering department concerned, to say the least. In 1963 and on into 1964, Buick was in charge of researching the Tornado's front drive system between the transmission and the inner CV joints, and their job essentially was to develop the differential and the drive axles. The guy who was in charge of that team was Jack DeCoux. One of the things they learned early on was the pinion bearings were failing the differential due to lubrication problems, so they made some changes to correct the issues, but Buick's upper management still wasn't impressed with the overall design, and after much discussion, ultimately, they decided to keep the Riviera a rear-wheel drive. Essentially, Buick engineers didn't like the way the big front-wheel drive pre-test vehicles rode and handled. They had a tendency to understeer, especially when they were pushed to the limit. And you'll remember that ride quality has always been one of Buick's hallmarks, but another was braking ability. Buick has almost always prided itself on its brakes, and some of the actual testing that went on back then was pretty interesting. They would take a handful of cars out to Colorado and drive them as hard as possible down Pikes Peak over and over again. I'm not sure how many of you out there have been to Pikes Peak, but that is a pretty steep downhill run. In fact, I believe it's somewhere near 14,000 feet. One heck of a ride, I'm sure, in a 1960s GM platform. The 1966 Buick Riviera did end up sharing some of Tornado's sheet metal design. Both cars used the same roof, glass, and inner doors. Beyond that, the frame and undercarriage. And while the second generation was quite a bit different than the earlier first gen, it retained its basic frame design, powertrain, and brakes, but the body was longer, wider, and about 200 pounds heavier. The headlights remained concealed and pivoted behind the grille when they weren't being used. Inside, the front and rear bucket seats and center console were replaced by a choice of bucket seats, or you could opt for conventional bench seats as standard equipment, which made the Riviera a full 6-passenger car for the first time. In 1967, Buick replaced that 425 nailhead engine with the all-new 430 cubic inch V8 rated at 360 horsepower, and listen to this, a whopping 475 pound-feet of torque. Just that improvement alone made a huge difference in performance. 1968 models had reshaped loop-type bumpers that wrapped around the front grille and tail lamps, and for the first time, hidden wiper blades made their debut. Sales set a new record in 1968 with 49,284 cars being sold. For the 1969 model year, there were a few minor styling changes, but for the most part, it remained a carryover from 1968. Some of the aesthetic changes were a slightly different grille, the front marker lights were slightly changed, and seat headrests were implemented just a bit differently. One of the interior changes that was most noticeable was the ignition switch was moved from the instrument panel to the steering column and locked the steering wheel and select lever when the key was removed. That feature became mandatory for the 1970 model year. Sales for 1969 improved again to a stellar 52,872 units, and even though the 1970 model sales dropped to 37,360 cars, the second generation Riviera was far more successful than the first, with 227,669 total units sold over 5 seasons. Of the second gen, the 1969 model year was definitely the most successful. One thing seems certain, there's no question that Buick made the right decision in going with rear-wheel drive. After the Torado's first year, when sales of Torados and Rivieras were running neck and neck, Rivieras then outsold Torados by huge margins during the 1967 through the 1969 campaigns. Original MSRP was $4,700, which, if you'll recall, is fully $2,000 less than the Cadillac. The estimated value today is about $28,000, depending on the level of build. So now it's your turn. Between these two cars, let us know which car you prefer and why. Thanks for hanging out with us today. It's always fun hanging out with you folks. Big thanks to everyone at the Automatic Transmission Rebuilders Association. ATRA makes our Clash of the Classics features possible. Next time you think you have a transmission problem or you just simply have a transmission question, always check them out at atra.com. We'll see you next time.